Of course, the penalty for not having every technical detail ironed out and working properly is that you do get punished with some biblical puns. And that's always a good idea anyway, because the Bible says, a merry heart doeth good like a medicine. So we'll give you just a few, not too much punishment. Since we'll be talking about Noah and the flood and how that plays into the production of amber all over the world, I'll start with some flood jokes. Okay. So, what kind of bird did Noah use to help him build the ark? What kind of bird did Noah use? The crane, of course. Yes, very good, very good. And why was everybody aboard Noah's ark afraid to play cards? Well, you see, they were all afraid to cut the deck. Yes. And what kind of lights did Noah use on the ark? Floodlights, of course. Very good. And why did God send a special angel, a guardian angel, to look over Noah, his family, and all the animals? Well, God figured they could use an archangel. And what were the most dangerous animals aboard Noah's ark? So dangerous that Noah demanded that they both be housed in iron cages. Well, aboard Noah's ark, the two most dangerous animals were the woodpecker and the beaver. You think about it? Okay, I don't want to go too long because we have a lot to cover tonight, but one more, just one more. How did Noah earn the title, the distinguished title, of the greatest stockbroker in the history of the world? Well, you see, he was the only man in history who was able to float his stock despite the fact that the entire world's assets were in liquidation. Quite a feat for a man in his day, or even today. Okay, now that we've loosened you up and I've dropped my laser pointer, get down here and get that. It still works. It does. It works. Great. Your brain out there. Okay. Well, lest we go too long, I want to get started with this. So tonight we're going to be looking at amber, an especially valuable jewel for creationists. Now, amber is not hardened wood sap. Many people seem to think, let me get this located there we go. Many people seem to think it's hardened wood sap, but it's not. It's wood resin that is hardened into an amber gem. Now the sap runs primarily toward the center of the trunk of the tree. It's important for transporting minerals and nutrients and glucose through the tree. And it's quite watery, not very thick. But the wood resin that comes out of trees, the pitch, the wood resin is very thick. It's about the color of honey, and it flows like honey, but perhaps with a slower bit of flow. But it acts as a kind of a immune defense for the tree. If a storm comes and breaks off a branch and there's a hole there in the tree, that would be an avenue for insects or animals to try to burrow into that tree. Also perhaps disease might get in through that avenue. And so it not only comes out and is very sticky, and so anything that tries to get into it gets stuck like a tar baby. Animals don't like it. Insects just get caught on it like fly paper. And then as the resin continues to flow, they get entrapped in the amber itself. And it stays there as a kind of a protective scab. Having antiseptic qualities, it keeps disease from getting into the wounded portion, and it keeps fungus out. And it stays there until the tree heals up enough. So it's kind of like a protective biological bandage or scab. Now, over time, as it's constantly exposed to air, it will begin to granulate and crystallize and break off into small pieces. We see some of that up here where it's granulating. And eventually this will harden and granulate, fall into little pieces on the ground, and eventually be weathered into the soil, and it will not turn into amber jewels. So it took some unusual scenario. Something had to happen to make this formerly liquid resin turn into hard amber, which is about as hard as plastic, about 2.5 on the Mohs hardness scale. So we believe that the flood is by far the best way of explaining the amber that we have found all around the world in sedimentary rocks and often in and closely associated with the rocks that surround coal fields. So, if we get this thing to work here, there we go. Now this is the kauri tree in New Zealand, and it's quite a large tree, has a circumference nearly as big as the redwoods. It's not as tall as the redwoods, but it has a large circumference. And we know that trees that were coniferous trees were the main contributors to the flow of resin that turned into amber during the Great Genesis Flood. Now, the kauri tree carries more resin than any other tree that we know of currently living today. There may have been a lot of forest of these back at the time of the flood. But if you cut a gouge into this, huge amounts of this resin will pour forth. And to give you a little better idea of just how big this tree is, we have this young lady here with her arms spread out. And you can see that it does indeed rival the circumference of the great redwood trees, even though it is not as tall as redwoods. But we hypothesize that it was a tree such as this that got a big gouge in it during the storms of the flood and wind and wave action causing tree trunks floating on the surface of the floodwaters to bang and bash into one another. And every time that do that, of course, the resin will flow out. And experiments have shown that when the resin is in water, it remains soft and pliable and sticky a lot longer than when it's just exposed to the air. It will relatively rapidly harden, granulate, and fall apart when it's constantly exposed to air. But underwater, it remains soft, pliable, and sticky for much longer. And that plays into how we explain a lot of the amber fossils that we have found through the flood scenario. Now, it was such a tree probably as this that got a big gash in it during the flood, and it exuded the largest resin flow that we're aware of that turned into the largest boulder of amber, I guess we'd call it, a boulder of amber. It was found in the coastal marshes of Denmark on the Baltic Sea, and apparently was thrown up there from the sea in a great storm or perhaps a tsunami. But they estimated it weighed 2,600 pounds and was the size of a mid-size automobile. So by all rights, that should have been put into a museum so we could see it to this day. But there was a lot of money to be made by cutting that huge chunk of amber into little amber gems, because that's where they make the money on it. It's been prized as a gem for thousands of years. Now, when Mount St. Helens erupted, December 18th, 1980, the blast force knocked down many trees in its vicinity. They estimated it had a blast force equivalent to a 20 megaton hydrogen bomb, 20 million tons of TNT. And it did knock down, they estimate, nearly 1 billion board feet of lumber, and many of those trees that had been knocked over, when the landslide came down from the blast and hit Spirit Lake, it pushed it up these mountains here, and all those dead trees, when it sloshed back into the lake basin, it pulled them in with it. And initially, they estimated there was close to 1 million logs floating on Spirit Lake right after that. This, of course, would be very similar to what we would expect to be happening all over the world during the Great Genesis Flood. There would be volcanoes blasting down forests. There would be huge tsunamis, the likes of which we can't even conceive of, nothing like we've ever seen in modern times, driven by greater earthquake activity than we've ever seen. So with blasting down the trees, with ripping them up with tsunami action and flood current action, you would have on the surface of the flood at that time huge mats of logs and vegetation. The wind and wave action battering these things together would produce many gouges that would exude the resin, and being in water, it would stay soft and sticky for a lot longer. And of course, any kind of dead animals, insects and other things, as we shall see, floating on the surface of the floodwaters at that time would be bashed and battered right into that soft, sticky resin, and thus become entombed in it. It also would flow down and drop down onto the ocean bottom and entomb ocean creatures, which we have found as well. So we feel this is a very good explanation. Mount St. Helens still has some logs on it after all these years. It's been quite a while since 1980, but you notice none of them have trees, leaves, or bark anymore. They've been thoroughly bashed and battered together, stripped everything, and some of them appear to be somewhat resistant to being waterlogged. That's why they're still floating, but a lot of them went down to the bottom in an upright position. Dr. Steve Austin, back when he was with ICR, did a sonar fish tow through the lake, got permit to do that, and he estimated there was some 15,000, perhaps 20,000 upright logs on the bottom of the lake, an actual forest of upright trees that didn't grow there, but they ended up there because of this catastrophe. So He and other creationist scientists have hypothesized that perhaps the best way to explain what we really see in the coal fields in the fossil record is these huge, absolutely huge mats of vegetation and trees stripped off the continents, floating on the floodwaters. As the vegetation got waterlogged, it would filter down to the bottom. Flood currents bringing in more sediment would cover it. There would be compaction, compression, and probably geothermal and geochemical heating. And of course, the heat drives off most elements except for carbon, thus carbonizing the plant material into dark coal. So what we have really at Mount St. Helens is like a microcosm of that. The main difference is that we don't have the constant inflow of sediments rapidly coming in, laying down layer after layer. And we find these scenarios in the fossil record where you have an upright tree trunk that went down. Often they'll be more buoyant at the top and still absorb water a little bit better at the bottom, so they're buoyant at the top and they tend to float around upright. But if it gets stuck in the bottom and rapidly buried, then it could be preserved. This is how we find it in the fossil record. To say, of course, that it grew there over many millions of years, it would have rotted into oblivion long before it could be covered by the very slow, gradual processes that the evolutionary theory postulates. But it's interesting that often in coal and in the sedimentary layers very near coal is where we also find amber, because that is what we need also to get that wood resin to convert into hard amber, which is about as hard as plastic. You need the pressure and the heating. That's the key, both to the formation of coal and the amber jewels. By the way, anybody know the oldest amber that they claim to have found anywhere? Well, they found it in a coal seam in Illinois, and that's supposed to be of the so-called Carboniferous age. They dated it to be 320 million years old. And yet, it's no tougher than plastic, has the same Mohs hardness rating as plastic. It's just a biochemical compound, nothing special, nothing magical about it. You know, you ask these evolutionist, crusaders, and they say, oh yes, well the amber has been there for millions of years, but they say, well, you're also an environmentalist, are you? Oh yes, and I should tell you something. You should avoid plastic, don't use plastic. Even thin plastic like saran wrap can last in a landfill for centuries. And if it's really thick plastic, like in a big thick picture or big thick plastic mug, that might last 10,000 years, perhaps as much as 100,000 years. And the worst thing is glass bottles. Glass bottles can last up to 1,000,000 years. Really? Well, hardened wood resin, no harder than plastic, can only last 100,000 years, according to them. The glass bottle can last 1,000,000 years, but amber, which is easy to scratch, is just hardened wood resin, nothing more. Supposedly lasted many millions of years. How can that be? How can they say both and justify both? Well, based on the actual experiments, no biochemical compound of any kind, including amber, can last much more than 100,000, 150,000 years. In the case of extremely strong proteins, such as we have with bone collagen, they might last a few 100,000 years, but not any of them have been measured to last, as we project in the future based on the observed rate of breakdown. None of them can last even 1,000,000 years, so it is indeed a big problem. Now, for centuries and thousands of years actually, in Europe, the main source of amber, actually the only known source of amber in the Western world, was on the Baltic coast, especially the southern coast of the Baltic Sea. I'll give you a close-up of that. And that's right directly south of Norway, Sweden, and Finland. And we believe that at the end of the flood, waters draining off the continents probably cut a channel down into one of these layers of amber that had been produced, thus exposing it to the seawater. And it may have even more thoroughly been tilled out by glacial action in the ice age that we would predict would happen after the Great Genesis Flood. So what we basically have here is a amber-rich sedimentary layer that has been cut into by both erosion and probably glacial action. So amber itself is quite light. It's not heavy, it's not like a rock. It's like plastic, it's quite lightweight. And if it has enough bubbles in it, it will actually float in seawater. And it, is easily pushed around by ocean currents and by waves because of its light weight. So we've actually found some of the ones that actually float clear up on the north coast of England, floating that far from the Baltic Sea. But most of it is semi-buoyant. It's easily pushed around by the wind or by the waves and the current action, but it doesn't usually get thrown up on the shore in large amounts unless there's a big storm. So for thousands of years, after a big storm stirred up some of this and threw it up onto the Baltic shore, people have gone out and found these beautiful amber gems. And it is in fact called to this day Baltic gold, because it is rather golden colored, and it is a semi-precious gemstone today. It's not really a stone, it's a semi-precious gem, and it is prized for its beauty, and it does still have value to this day. So for many centuries, this simple means of getting it, you don't have to necessarily wait for a big storm to throw it up on the beach. It's always tumbling around to some extent in the wave action right there. It doesn't usually get thrown up unless there's a storm, but you can take fine mesh nets like that, kind of fish around in the tumbling surf and snare these amber gems. So that's actually been done for many centuries. Here we have an old woodcut from the medieval times where the serfs were serving their lord and master, the noblemen who actually owned certain sections of the Baltic Sea. They purchased them or got them by right of being a nobleman, and they would have their serfs work a lot because it was very rare back then and worth a lot of money. They often would build a watchtower to look up and down the beach, make sure there were no trespassers, and if you were caught trespassing on an amber beach, even if you had no amber in your pockets or in your purse, they would take you out and string you up publicly as a public example, because you don't trespass on an amber beach. It was a very, very valuable gem, and they wanted to protect it. Now then, in the 1st century, the Roman Emperor Nero, who is infamous for very horribly persecuting early Christians, he fancied himself an artist, and he loved artistry and artwork, and he is purported to have said that a single good quality amber carving, no bigger than a thumb, was worth the price of 2 healthy slaves. Now, how much was that worth? That was worth about 3 years' wage for an average worker back then. So that was a lot of money. But by the 1st century, the Romans had figured out that amber wasn't anything special or magical the way it had been thought to be in the centuries before the time of Christ. Many of them thought it was tears of the sun, that their sun god had wept, and the tears fell down into the Baltic Sea and solidified into these beautiful amber gems. So it had religious and mystical concepts around it that made it even more valuable. But by the 1st century, the Romans had figured out it was just hardened wood resin, but still it was beautiful and it was still rare and valuable. Nowadays, because of the adage of supply and demand, it's only a semi-precious gem, because we have found it all over the place. No longer do we have to go to the Baltic coast. You can drill down, do a core sample if you find amber in it. You can do further digging to see if it's a rich deposit, and if so, you sink down a mine shaft and mine it directly. So almost all amber today, the majority of it at least, is actually directly mined in these amber-rich sedimentary deposits. But they do still get it up on the Baltic coast as well. So because we found it all over the world, and just like we find coal all over the world, the flood would predict these type of situations would prevail that would aid the actual formation of the wood resin and transformation of it into amber. Now, the movie Jurassic Park caused a temporary spike in the value of amber and interest in amber. You may remember the thesis of the movie was a miner found this big chunk of amber with a big mosquito in it, and it had a big red abdomen full of dinosaur blood. And so they drilled in and extracted that and used the DNA to clone dinosaurs for Jurassic Park. Of course, even the evolutionists admit that that is total science fiction, because for cloning, you have to have a viable egg of the same species. That you take that DNA out, put the DNA of what you're wanting to clone into that egg, and get the clone that way. Of course, we don't have any viable dinosaur eggs that I'm aware of. In the movie, they used amphibian eggs, which is really crazy because it's not even the same species or the same genus or the same family. It's an entirely different class. So it certainly never would have worked. But it did bring amber much more to the public consciousness after that. But, like I say, for many thousands of years, it was always prized for its beauty and its rarity, which it had been rare in Europe for a long time. Now, Frederick William I of Prussia, on the left here, he inherited a small amber room that his father and mother, the former king and queen, were putting together. He didn't really care for it, and he wanted to curry favor with Peter the Great of Russia, and also to celebrate his alliance with Peter the Great against Sweden. And so he gifted that small amber room, the amber from it, to Peter the Great, and Peter and his wife Catherine the Great. They liked that idea. They wanted to make a much bigger amber room, but it never actually happened in their lifetime. did not happen until after Peter the Great had died, and one of his daughters said, well, let's put this vision into practical reality. So she hired an Italian who was really gifted artist in working with amber, had a lot of experience in amber jewelry and amber carvings, and he designed this beautiful amber room, which was finally produced there in about the mid-1700s, I believe. And it was called by the Russians the eighth wonder of the world, and it was indeed spectacular. Walls 30 feet tall, so thickly encrusted with amber jewels and carvings that it was estimated to have 13,000 pounds of amber. That's the weight of 2 good-sized African elephants, if you want to use that for comparison. And it was so designed also that on the west end of this room they had large windows facing the west, so when the sun set in the west, the sunlight would shine directly on it. Of course, at sunset it tends to be more reddish anyway, and that reddened sunlight hitting the amber gave it an absolutely ethereal glow and hue that by all accounts was just almost supernatural the way they talked about it. So it remained there in all of its glory and unmolested until World War II. So it was there at the Catherine Palace. Now the Catherine Palace we see here, this is the entrance to it, is located a little ways outside of St. Petersburg, Russia. And just go in the way, if you ever get over there, it's worth driving up to see it. And it's much larger than the entrance. We get a little more idea of how grand it is, and you especially see it when you look at it from an aerial view. So it stayed there in all of its glory, unmolested until World War II. When the Nazis invaded the Soviet Union, of course, they were robbing all kinds of artwork from anywhere they conquered in Europe, and some of that artwork to this day has never been recovered. They hid it somewhere and nobody knows where it is, so except the Lord, so he hasn't been telling anybody lately. But the Russians found themselves in a predicament because the Germans were advancing so rapidly with their blitzkrieg tactics that the Russians realized they didn't have time to take the amber down and hide it somewhere. So they tried to rig up scaffolding and put some kind of wallpaper over it to cover it up with a facade, hoping the Germans wouldn't notice, but they did. And they tore down the scaffolding, tore down the wallpaper, and sent in a small army of German soldiers who actually stripped those walls bare within about a day and a half, put it into about 37 large crates, and hauled it back to the Russian oblast or enclave on the Baltic Sea, which today we call Kaliningrad, and it was put in the Königsberg Castle. And much of it was left still in the crates, but some of it was put on display as a kind of a war trophy that they were bragging about. Well, by 1944, the fortunes of war had changed. The Germans were on the retreat, the Soviets were advancing. They were about to attack and retake the city, which today is called Kaliningrad. And that attack was preceded by an aerial bombardment and an artillery barrage, which heavily damaged the Königsberg Castle and set it on fire. And most historians believe that that is what happened to the marvelous amber room. It got burned up because it is just wood resin, hardened wood resin, and it is quite flammable. And in fact, it has been burned for centuries as a form of incense. Small shards and slivers of amber, not big enough to be suitable for jewelry, was still collected and burned because it gave off this rich, warm aroma of pine, because it is actually resin from coniferous trees. Well, some say the Germans took it and hid it somewhere, but if so, no living witness knows where that is, so it's still lost. Some say it was on a ship that was on the Baltic and sank, but they've dived on that ship, they found it, looked all through it, can't find it. So if there were a category in the Guinness Book of World Records for the largest, the heaviest, and most expensive work of art ever stolen and never recovered, this would take the cake. Because estimates of the value of the amber room vary from as little as $200 million to in excess of $600 million today, if it could have been found. Well, that's a lot of money, but it was especially a black eye to the pride of the Russians. This was their wonderful eighth wonder of the world, and the Nazis stole it and probably got burned up. So, under the administration of Leonid Brezhnev back in 1979, they decided that they would start building a replica of the amber room. Now, it wasn't going to be the same size. The walls would be only a little over 20 feet tall instead of 30. Square footage I don't think was quite as great also, but they wanted to somehow replace the eighth wonder of the world with something that looked at least reminiscent of it. Now, Brezhnev didn't get to see that happen. He died within a few years, and because of monetary problems and because of a lack of Baltic amber and the money to purchase it and the workmen to hire and pay, it took 24 years, nearly a quarter of a century. So they tried to copy as much as they could the artwork of the original from photographs of the original amber room, at least to some extent. They had only a skeleton crew working, and sometimes they laid them off because they didn't have a budget to do anything. Ironically, one of the reasons they finally got it completed was because a country donated both money and Baltic amber to make it possible. Anybody guess what country that was? It was Germany. I guess they had pangs of conscience about the fact that it got stolen and probably burned up, and it was their fault. So they did put it together, and they did use thinner amounts of amber than the thick ones that were used in the original, just because they wanted to save money. But the replica is quite beautiful. It's well worth seeing if you ever get over near St. Petersburg, Russia. And although it's not as tall and it's not as thick, it's still quite glorious. They estimate it has 6,000 pounds of amber, whereas the original had 13,000, so less than half. But in 1923, it was finally completed and dedicated by Putin, who looked a lot younger back then, and it is open to the public now. You can take tours of it, and it is used for public meetings sometimes, press conferences, things of that nature. They did do actual gold plating of much of the filigree and the statues there, copying the style of the original. And although it's not quite as big and not quite as beautiful, I think it still has captured an awful lot of the original opulence and glory and grandeur of the original. So amber has been historically a prized, valuable jewel and a very beautiful jewel that has been coveted for a long time. But why is it an especially valuable and beautiful jewel to creationists? Because it has even more powerful evidence than the dinosaur soft tissue we have found, that these fossils and these rocks that were laid down at the time those fossils were entrapped can only be several thousands of years old. Amber fossils have evidence that shows even more strongly that it could not have lasted any longer of that and been in the extreme beautiful perfection that we find them in. So let's recap the evidence with the dinosaur soft tissues. Dr. Mary Schweitzer, currently a paleontologist at North Carolina State University, back in the early 2000s, she was working, I think, as a doctoral candidate under the famous dinosaur scientist Jack Horner up at Montana State University. And they had a big T-Rex femur they'd found in the Hell Creek Formation of Montana. They tried to airlift it out, but it was so heavy they couldn't do it. And so they had to actually break it in two and haul it out one piece at a time. So Jack Horner said, well, you know, it's not very often that we break a big T-Rex femur in two. Why don't you take a look at it under the microscope? Well, when she did, she was shocked to find soft tissue after she had treated it with mild acid to get rid of some of the calcium and other bone we had remaining. The soft tissue, including blood vessels, when you squished it out, you got nucleated red blood cells typical of reptiles. Now she professes to be an evangelical Christian. She goes to an evangelical church. She believes in the deity of Christ, virgin birth, resurrection, all the basic Orthodox Christian doctrines, but she believes that God used evolution as his means of creation. So this bothered her. You know, I would think that she'd say, gee, all my atheist colleagues here at the university bug me all the time for going to an evangelical church and believing in Jesus. Well, I'll admit I was wrong, but you know, you guys are wrong too. That fossil record cannot possibly be millions of years old. The fossils cannot be that old. And that means evolution is kaput. Everybody agrees. If the fossil record is relatively young, being no more than about 4,500 years since the time of the Genesis flood, the whole theory collapses. It simply cannot be true. But because she was an atheistic evolutionist and did not want to admit that she was wrong and that God's word was literally true in this regard, which this evidence clearly showed, she tried to say, well, maybe iron in the hemoglobin of the red blood cells was released after it died, and this saturated the tissue and caused cross-linking, or in other words, additional chemical bonds to form that would allow it to hold together over a long period of time. Now, she should have put that to the normal thermodynamic tests, like we do with all evidence like this. You heat it up, because we can measure it. Thermodynamic degeneration and decay is much more efficient at high temperature. So you heat it up to a place where we can actually see over a period of time, weeks or months, whatever, and measure a certain rate of decay. Then you do it at a slightly lower temperature, and you see how much is decaying at that temperature. Then at a lower temperature, how much is decaying. So you get a decay curve. Then you plug in the Arrhenius equations, which are designed to predict, based on that decay curve, even at lower temperatures, such as we find generally 10 feet down in the ground for quite a ways down, it remains about 50 to 55 degrees all year long. That's a pretty cool temperature. But even at that cool temperature, the thermodynamic disintegration, one of the proven physical laws of physics, says that all things go from order to disorder, from cosmos to chaos, from complexity to simplicity. And thus the law predicts, and has been proven by science to be true, that the bonds that hold these chemical compounds together, biochemical compounds, must rupture over time. The question is, how long? Well, all of these experiments, even those done by evolutionists, have shown that they can't last more than just several hundreds of thousands of years, not even 1 million years. Yet dinosaurs are supposed to be, the youngest ones are supposed to be 65 million years old, the oldest ones 240 million years old. So there is a big problem, because these things don't even look degenerated at all. They look incredibly fresh. That is conceivable based on the thermodynamic analysis that you wouldn't see much on a time scale of 4,500 years. You would start to see it after several tens of thousands of years, and after hundreds of thousands of years, you wouldn't see it at all. Just a pile of very fine dust. No definition of anything whatsoever. So this is a major problem, and it has bothered another evangelical Christian who also believes in an old earth. Now, he does not call himself a theistic evolutionist, he calls himself a progressive creationist. This is Dr. Hugh Ross of the ministry Reasons to Believe, which in my opinion is a misnomer, because he does teach us to believe the New Testament, but he certainly challenges the traditional understanding of Genesis chapter 1 through 11. He does not believe in a global flood, even though the Bible explicitly teaches that. He does not believe in six-day creation. So it bothered him, and so he said in this regard, if a sample is isolated from any exposure to bacteria and oxygen, then the soft tissue evidence easily can be preserved for over 100 million years. Well, thank you for your opinion. Just because you're a PhD scientist in astronomy doesn't make you infallible. You're still a human, full of pride, prejudice, preconceived ideas of fallen nature, all the frailties every human being has, and you have a dog in this fight. You don't want to admit you're wrong any more than the evolutionists want to admit they're wrong. And this evidence shows anybody believing in an old fossil record appears to be dead wrong, like it or not. Now, in his ministry, he also has a PhD scientist in biochemistry, Dr. Fazil Rana. His nickname is Fuzz. And my hat's off to him, because he got saved out of Islam, which is not easy to do, and he is now a professing evangelical Christian. But like Hugh Ross, he believes that God took billions of years in progressive creation, and therefore the dinosaurs are many millions of years old. And so this bothered him, so he wrote a book called Dinosaur Blood and the Age of the Earth. And in there he made this type of argument that collagen, which is like bone collagen, is like the toughest protein. It is about 3 times less susceptible to thermodynamic breakdown than the average proteins. So I always like to talk about collagen as if it's some kind of magic bullet, but the actual experiments show it doesn't hold up much longer anyway. But he said collagen, or at least fragments of it, could survive 68 million years in an environment devoid of water, oxygen, and microbes, given its structure. Now remember, Hugh Ross said to get rid of 2 things that break it down relatively quick, it'll last millions of years. What was it? Microbes and oxygen, okay? Now he's saying 3, microbes, oxygen, and water. Of course, oxygen is a corrosive agent. It oxidizes and breaks down chemical compounds over time. Water is called the universal what? Solvent, because it breaks down more chemicals than any other known solvent, and we definitely know it does break down biochemicals over time by the process known as hydrolysis. So if you get rid of microbes that would eat it up quickly, get rid of oxygen that would oxidize it, get rid of water that would hydrolyze it, then supposedly it can last for millions of years. But the problem is that when they've run these experiments thermodynamically, they eliminate those 3 from the outset. They assume optimal conditions. And what does that mean? Well, here we have a couple of very knowledgeable British scientists, Buckley and Collins, and they did a lot of this testing of bone collagen in relation to archaeological finds in Great Britain, where everybody believed, the bones of animals, the bones of humans they found at these archaeological finds were no more than just several thousands of years old, not even hundreds of thousands, not millions at all. So finding bone collagen intact was not controversial, because everybody believed these are relatively recent fossils, no big deal. Then we find it in T-Rex and in other dinosaurs and in other creatures, going clear down to the Cambrian, over 500 million years, in other words, more than 500 million years old, we found it. Now it's a big problem. They did not expect that. But notice the research showed it will take between 0.2 and 0.7 million years. How much is that in hundreds of thousands of years? From 200,000 to 700,000 years. 700,000 being the maximum that the strongest bone collagen could last based on the actual thermodynamic experiments. And notice it's at low temperature, not high temperature. 10 degrees Celsius, which is only 50 degrees Fahrenheit. And in that time it would fall to just 1%, 99% fall into dust. Now notice they admit in an optimal burial environment. What does that mean? No microbes, no oxygen, no water. So they say, well, get rid of these three and it'll last. No, the actual experiments show when you get rid of those three, thermodynamic breakdown alone is more than sufficient to wipe it out in just hundreds of thousands of years. And when we find it in such exquisitely refined and beautiful shape, it can only be several thousand years old to explain its very good condition. Now, it gets even worse because Brian Thomas, staff scientist at Institute for Creation Research, where I did some of my graduate study, he got his PhD at the University of Liverpool in England, directly in the field of paleobiochemistry. In other words, biochemicals found in fossil bones. Now, he did this chart here showing his research at a major science symposium, where he took a more modern instrument than what Buckley and Collins used, the F-tier spectroscopy device, and he was able to demonstrate repeatedly by repeatable tests that the rate of breakdown observed by Buckley and Collins was limited by the capabilities of their instruments. With this more refined instrumentation, they were able to detect it was breaking down at least twice as fast as what could be detected by Buckley and Collins. So you take that upper limit of 700,000 years for the toughest bone collagen, cut it in half to 350,000 years. And for other proteins, which aren't nearly as resistant, you can cut it down by about a third. That's all. So this is devastating, and Dr. Kevin Anderson, who is a member of the Creation Research Society, of which I'm a lifetime sustaining member, he is a PhD PhD biologist, and he passed away just a year or two ago. He's gone home to be with the Lord and have his reward. But he wrote an excellent book I'd highly recommend, Echoes of the Jurassic. That's available from the Creation Research Society, which you can look up on the internet and order a copy of that book. But in that book, he said, plus many documented examples of preserved tissue and proteins come from fossils in virtually bloodless settings. The preservation of dinosaur and reptile skin, preservation of a chitin protein complex in a beard worm, which is supposed to be over 500 million years old, by the way, and a sponge, and preservation of protein derivatives in a consortium of algae were certainly not a result of blood baths that soaked the biomaterial in hemoglobin. So he said, we have totally undercut Mary Schweitzer's argument that the hemoglobin and iron from blood makes it last that long. Obviously, where there is no iron, that argument is completely void. It's completely undercut. They need something that explains it across the board, and in this case, it can't even qualify because it's not there. There's one thing that does explain it. It's only several thousand years old. That would explain it every time, but that is unpalatable to them, unfortunately. Now, Dr. Anderson continues, he said, many of these dinosaur proteins, for example, hemoglobin, myosin, actin, and tropomyosin, are not nearly as structurally resistant to degradation as collagen. In fact, there is no experimental evidence that all these other proteins could survive for more than a fraction of the time that collagen could survive. I always want to talk about collagen. What about the majority of proteins we find are not collagen? What about those? Well, he goes on to say, in the book Dinosaur Blood and the Age of the Earth, on page 34, by Dr. Fazl Rana, he mentions the ravaging effects of ground radiation. You see, they always talk about three things that'll break it down in less than 1 million years, but there's actually 5. The 5 are microbes, water, oxygen, and the second law of thermodynamics, which is inexorable, cannot be stopped, can only be slowed down by lower temperatures. But even if these were at 0 centigrade, freezing temperature, it would only allow them to last for a few million years instead of a few 100,000 years. It wouldn't make any significant difference even there. And most of these are found in the temperate zone where they weren't under long periods of inundation by ice anyway. So we have those 5. The 5th one, he admits here, ground radiation. See, even sedimentary rocks are composed of particles that have been eroded out of igneous rocks, and igneous rocks often have radioisotopes in them, such as uranium and thorium. and other decay chain isotopes in the decay chains of those radioactive agents. So he's saying we've got these particles, many of which have minute amounts of radioactive components that give off radiation. It's called ground radiation, and it is relatively mild, but it gives off alpha, beta, and even gamma radiation. Although mild, when you start to calculate the effect of it over several 100,000 years, it appears to be obvious that it would completely erase any biomolecules, completely. No soft tissue, no cells, no red blood cells, no nothing. Now, they don't like to talk about this. You notice this is in a footnote of Dr. Fazal Rana's book. He put it in fine print in a footnote, hoping people wouldn't bother to read the footnotes. But when he talked about it to the general public in his book, he said it was only 3: microbes, oxygen, and water. What about the second law of thermodynamics and the tests that the evolutionists have done to show it can't last very long, and ground radiation, which nobody even has a clue or a theoretical explanation as to how that could be stopped? It seems to be an intractable problem that they just don't want to acknowledge, don't want to talk about. Now, how many of you heard that there were 5 things that break it down in less than 1 million years? You heard that before tonight? If you didn't, it's not by accident. They censor people. They suppress the truth in their unrighteousness. Now again, Dr. Anderson says, other studies also challenge the iron model. Paleontologist Derek Briggs, who I believe is an evolutionist, cites results of a study where the addition of iron did not slow the decay of shrimp. Analysis of the Thescelosaurus vertebrae, which they found in the Hell Creek Formation of Montana, found iron present in some of the surrounding fossil, but virtually no iron was detected within the preserved tissue. In other words, the iron is supposed to make it last a long time. We found plenty of examples documented where there's not enough iron to do anything, and yet it is still soft tissue. Proteins are intact, red blood cells and osteocyte cells beautifully intact. So he says that virtually no iron was detected. Neither does this model nor any preservation model protect the tissue and proteins from the ravages of that old bugaboo they don't want to talk about, ground radiation. So there's 5 things. Even if you eliminate the 3, the last 2 nobody knows how to eliminate, and it is a big problem. Now, we found all kinds of things, as you'd predict from the flood model. In amber, all kinds of dead creatures could be floating on the floodwaters, get bashed into that soft resin and entombed in it. Here we have a bird that was preserved. Here we have a bird in its beak. Here we have lizards. We found a number of different lizards. They often look like they're battered and mangled, as you'd expect from that wind and wave action, bashing them into the wood resin on these trees. This one was severed in half, and its right front foot was also severed, but the rest of it is in marvelous shape, including its eye. Pretty remarkable, since it's supposed to be 42 million year Baltic amber. Here we have an actual complete lizard in a large chunk of amber. This is very rare. If this were put up at auction, it would go for tens of thousands of dollars easily. Now, on this large piece of amber, we have the shell of a marine creature, an ammonite. They've gone extinct, as far as we know. But we have its shell there, and as we predict on the flood model, you'll find a mixture of both land and marine creatures embedded in amber, because you get all of that with these floating log mats. All that would come into play. They say that there's at least fragments of 40 different identifiable different kinds of creatures in this one amber relic here. Ammonites, as well as mites, spiders, millipedes, beetles, cockroaches, flies, wasps, sea slaters, and marine gastropods, which means ocean snails. So the squid, cuttlefish, octopi, and chambered nautilus, they're all in this same cephalopod category that the cuttlefish is in, and it's definitely marine creatures. And there's also many other marine organisms found in amber. For example, barnacles and a marine isopod. Of course, if it's falling down onto the ocean bottom from those log mats, it'd still be soft and sticky and would be able to entrap these marine organisms on the bottom. Here we have a crab trapped in amber. And here we have a marine snail, and of all things, a trilobite. Now, a trilobite is a kind of a bottom-dwelling crab-like creature similar to the horseshoe crab that still lives today, that they claim dates back to hundreds of millions of years. When we find it in the fossil record, it looks the same today. Amazing that its ancestor evolved all the way up to man, but its other ancestors remained the same. But anyway, the amber falling down would encapsulate this, and it wouldn't mineralize, As is often the case with many fossils, they have infiltration of silica, calcite, certain cementation agents that replace the biomaterial with minerals, and thus they're hard as rock. This isn't. It'd be interesting to dig into this and see what kind of organs and structure on the inside. It should all be preserved. But trilobites are supposed to be anywhere from as little as 252 million years to a little over 500 million years old. And yet there it is, beautifully preserved in amber, no stronger than plastic, that shouldn't last more than at most 100,000 years, even in a landfill. And red algae, of course, of the marine kind. We also find trapped in ancient amber sea single-celled creatures, these single-celled creatures called the diatoms, and these make beautiful glass exoskeletons or glass greenhouses. They actually are photosynthetic, single-celled algae, and there's so many quadrillions of them in the ocean that they account for 20 to 25% of our oxygen, which means they produce more oxygen than all of the tropical rainforest in the world combined. So although they're very tiny, they are very important, and we find them in amber, again, as we'd expect, because of these floating log mats on the ocean. Now, we find very well beautifully preserved plants, leaves where we can see the vein structure under higher magnification of the microscope. We can see the individual plant cells beautifully preserved. Now the amber shouldn't have lasted, and the plants should not have lasted. How much collagen is there in plants, by the way? What percentage? 0, yeah, 0. So their big argument, oh, well, collagen lasts. Well, here you don't have any collagen. Not that it would last anyway, according to the experiments. Also here we have a fern-like branch, and when it's backlit, it looks kind of like a silhouette. But when you shine bright light on the front of it, what do we see? Brilliant green. What causes that? It's caused by biochemicals known as pigmentation agents, and they absorb light frequencies in certain colors and reflect only in a certain color, in this case green. Now, if those biomolecules, those pigment molecules, were corrupted by disintegration much at all, they wouldn't be able to perform that job. You wouldn't see any color, really, it just wouldn't work. But we still see it green after supposedly 42 million years in this Baltic amber. Well, maybe it's green because it's green with youth, really not as old as they claim. We see that also in the cases of these insects. In this secular article, these insects preserved in amber are still glowing 99 million years later. A little hard to believe. The amber shouldn't have survived anywhere near that long, nor the insects, which have practically no collagen at all, just a tiny fraction of 1%, so little that we only recently found out they had any at all. So they don't have anything special, no magic bullet to keep them from disintegrating. But you'll notice this iridescent, shiny, metallic, deep color doesn't come from pigmentation molecules. It comes from microscopic reflective ridges, so tiny you can't even see them without a microscope. They have to be oriented to reflect the light in a special frequency to give this shiny, metallic, deep, iridescent color. If those were to break down, which they would do because they're very small, in a short time, you wouldn't see that at all. So the shiny and colorful skin on some bugs does not come from pigment molecules, but ridges, which direct light to create the effect. Well, why do we have all this color, all this iridescence, all this glowing, colorful beauty? Well, because they're glowing with youth. They can't possibly be anywhere near 99 million years old, not even 999,000 years. It's just not conceivable based on known science. Now here we have what they claim is the oldest mosquito ever found in amber. Found in Lebanon, they claim this amber is 130 million years old. Yet look at all the delicate features there. I mean, the amber itself should have disintegrated into dust in just a little over 150,000 years, and the insects themselves are less resilient than the amber. But notice all the delicate fibers here, delicate little hair-like structures from the antennae. All the compound eyes with their many ommatidia, or little individual lenses, beautifully preserved. I mean, it looks like somebody took a dead mosquito, poured some liquid lucite plastic on it, let it set up overnight, and then photographed it. It looks that good. That's simply inconceivable. In just tens of thousands of years, these delicate small structures like hairs would have disintegrated. They would not be visible. And yet there they are. Now, amber jewelry is a good conversation piece for creation evidence. You may notice that I'm wearing amber rings because it helps to give me an in. People ask, oh, is that real amber? I go, yes. You know, this Baltic amber is supposedly 42 million years old with this nice fly fossilized in it. This is supposed to be Burmite amber from former Burma, now called Myanmar. You can see the tiny little plant spores in it, beautifully preserved. And yet plastic, they tell us, won't last more than 100,000 years in a landfill. How did this last longer when it's not any tougher? Plus we have ground radiation hitting it. We have thermodynamic breakdown, and experiments show it can only last at the most maybe 150,000 years or so. Why is it there? So you plant seeds of doubt. Every day they plant seeds of doubt, especially in our youth. I like to plant counter seeds of doubt in their belief in the fossil record age, because if they don't have that age, they don't have evolution. Simple as that. And I also do that because a lot of our young people today are kind of jaded. When they see something on a screen, they go, well, that could be AI produced, or that could be computer generated imagery. You know, they can do fantastic things today. You know, Lord of the Rings and all this was all fantasy, but it looked real, didn't it? Well, here we have something that's concrete. You can look at it, you can touch it, you can smell it, you can look at it under the microscope and see it with your own eyes. You can even taste it if you want to. It doesn't really taste like much of anything. Don't ask me how I know that, but it doesn't. But the point is, they can see firsthand this is not CGI, computer-generated imagery. This is real, and it's a real fatal problem for the theory of evolution. Now, why are amber fossils even much worse than the evidence from dinosaur soft tissue? Because we have these two other factors in amber commonly that we do not have with the dinosaurs. Out of the 5 that would break them down in much less than 1 million years, 4 out of those 5 apply to amber, because there is not exclusion of oxygen. Often we have plants and insects partially encapsulated, in some cases fully encapsulated with bubbles. And we've drilled into these bubbles in amber, which are very common, and analyzed them, you know, hundreds of times now, and they appear to have a higher percentage of oxygen than we have in the atmosphere today. Back at the time of the flood, when these were formed, they apparently had 29 to 30% oxygen. The average oxygen percentage today is only 21%. So oxygen is corrosive, and it would cause this to corrode and disintegrate. Does anybody know, by the way, the fastest form of oxidation that we commonly observe? Well, it's such a problem that we have firehouses housing firemen to take care of the problem. It's called fire. At very high temperature, oxidation has a runaway effect. It becomes extremely efficient, and it does what oxidation does best. It reduces things to ashes and dust. Imagine this plant bud being on fire, because that's what oxidation is, but it's just in slow motion. You won't see the ashes and dust for maybe a few tens of thousands of years. But if it was even that old, you should see a big pocket of dust down here where it's been corroding and oxidizing that, but it's not there. You can even see the delicate texture, if you look closely, on the leaf bud. The texture has not been removed. It's just inconceivable that it could be as old as they claim it to be. Now, not just with plants, but also with insects and arachnids, we often find them intersected by bubbles. This is from my own private collection, where we have here a winged scale insect. When we get a close-up of it, you can see it has bubbles on its back, bubbles on its side, bubbles on its underbelly. It's encased in bubbles with oxygen. They should have oxidized it into dust within just several tens of thousands of years, yet there it is, looking perfectly good. Here we have another one from my private collection, a mosquito, which has this big bubble on its side, and it has this bubble on its back there. Now we take a close-up of that bubble on the back. Can you see the hairs protruding out of it? Those thin hairs should have been oxidized. The whole thing should have been, fallen apart by thermodynamic disintegration anyway, within 150,000 years or so. But it's even worse when you have oxygen in play, which the amber fossils often do. Here we have a giant fungus gnat, and you can see very clearly this bubble here, this dark bump up here actually is translucent. I've seen it under the microscope because, again, it's one from my private collection, and light passes through it. That means it's a bubble too. It's turned somewhat brown. This one is still more clear. When we take a close-up look at it, we see the upper body and legs inside the bubble should have oxidized rapidly, relatively speaking, a few tens of thousands of years. There's no indication of any significant oxidation whatsoever. And here we have a fly trapped in, we've got bubbles here, but big bubbles partially encapsulating this fly. And when we look at the close-up, notice its head, its eyes, and this portion of its thorax is inside this bubble. Yet the delicate ommatidia are clearly there, the antennae and these hairs. I mean, they're very minor mass. There's no amber there supporting it, holding it in place. It's suspended in air with richer oxygen than we have today. How can it even be there? those should have disappeared into dust by oxidation in just several tens of thousands of years. This is supposed to be 42 million years old because they say so. And here we have a creature trapped in a bubble. When we take a close-up look at it, you know what that is? That's a little aphid, but it's entirely encapsulated in a bubble, and yet we can still see the definitive features of its structure on the inside. Here we have a spider partially encapsulated with bubbles. Here's the reverse angle on that. And on this spider, this is one from my private collection again, we see that it has all kinds of bubbles on its legs. You see the legs are inside the bubbles, okay? And notice there's a bubble somewhat opaque here around the head and the thorax, and a bubble around the abdomen. This thing should have disintegrated by oxidation in just several tens of thousands of years. This is supposed to be 42 million years old. Let's take a close-up of that abdomen. Can anybody see the little hairs still in there? Yep, those thin, delicate hairs, which would have been so easily oxidized into dust, are still preserved. Here we have a different spider, again from my private collection. So a lot of things you see here you won't see with any other creationist presentation because they don't have my fossils. But I spent a pretty penny finding some of the best ones out there and paying a good high price on auction to get them because they're so stunning and irrefutable evidence that this fossil record they claim to be so many millions of years old can't. Amber and the fossils in them are a time capsule and a chronometer that indicates it cannot be very old. So the hairs on the spider leg here are in the bubbles, but still there. Notice in this big opaque bubble, we have this leg which is partially broken here, but you can see the hairs. See the hairs sticking up out of that leg? It's in a bubble. Nothing supporting it, just air, and yet it's there after 42 million years. I don't think so. Now here we have a fly with a bubble on its back, but to the left of it, what do we have entirely encased, all of its body encased in a bubble? Not just partially, but completely. Anybody know what that is? Well, it looks like a tick, but it's not. It's much smaller than a tick. It is a mite. And mites are so tiny that they average only about 0.3 to 0.4 millimeters in size. Incredibly tiny. I mean, with the unaided eye, you look at it, it looks like a speck of dust. Until you put it under the microscope, you can't even tell what it is. But ticks do have, I should say they do have, or they don't have much hair. Ticks don't, but mites do. Mites tend to have hair. Now, because they're so tiny, their hairs are relatively extremely fine and extremely tiny. Now, inside this bubble here, do you see the hairs protruding from the back of its abdomen? Very clear. Now, because of the reflection of the bubble here, you can't see it, but under a microscope, I can see very clearly the mandibles have all kinds of little hairs sticking out of them. Fine little hairs. Those should have disintegrated by oxidation in just tens of thousands of years. But it gets even worse when we find bubbles in amber that act like a carpenter's level. They're in water packets, and when you tilt it back and forth, the bubble moves around because it's in water. So we have both oxygen and water. Now we see, for example, here, water packet here called anhydrous, okay, and air bubble inside it. Now, it always goes up, so if we turn it this way, the bubble should go to the side, and indeed when they turn it that way, sure enough, the bubbles came up to the side, actually move around inside of there. Now here we have a flower, and down here we have the sepals. Now in the bud state, the sepals cover the bud and protect it, but when it blooms, the sepals come down at the bottom as kind of a support feature. But we found a sepal in amber, supposed to be many millions of years old. Here's a look at it. There's your sepal, and this looks like a bubble here, but that's actually a packet of water. And this is an air bubble inside that packet of water. Now it's close to the edge here because that's the direction up. What if we invert it and turn it upside down? Where predictably will the air bubble go? Well, it will move up, and you can see it's moved quite a distance from near the edge here all the way up here. So this sepal is completely in contact with both water and its hydrolytic activity, oxygen with its oxidative capability, and the second law, and ground radiation. It just gets worse and worse. Now here we have a moving water and bubble that's actually infiltrated inside an ant, right inside its abdomen. We'll give you a close-up of that. There it is. You tilt this back and forth, the bubble moves back and forth. Now they should have done photographs of that in this advertisement, but I found one where they did. Here we have the ant, and when we get a close-up of it, we find that there's an air bubble in here. Water has infiltrated the abdomen, there's an air bubble there. Now the head is tilted slightly down, so the air bubble is over here. If we tilt it slightly up, where will the air bubble move? it'll move from there to over here. Predictably, when we do that, guess what? It moved right over there. So there's water with the hydrolytic effect and oxygen with the oxidative effect inside the abdomen, and those would have broken it down to an unrecognizable mass of dust in just several tens of thousands of years. So this is supposed to be many millions of years old. But it gets even worse. 40-million-year-old DNA. Now Kino, a microbiologist at California State Polytechnic University, he is an evolutionist by the way, dissected a Dominican stingless bee trapped in 25 to 40 million-year-old amber, found bacterial spores, a dormant state of bacteria, has revived them and grown them, and analyzed some of their DNA and found it closely matches the same bacteria found in modern Dominican bees. Well, of course it'd be close, it's only separated by a few thousands of years, not millions of years. But the big question is how the amber and the bacteria weren't completely disintegrated into dust by thermodynamic decay and by ground radiation. I mean, it should not be viable at all for any longer than a few thousand years, and it shouldn't even exist at all once you get past tens of thousands to hundreds of thousands of years. And it gets worse. 45-million-year-old brewer's yeast that still works. This brewery in California, their slogan is, come and taste how beer would have tasted 45 million years ago. Because they found brewer's yeast in amber, extracted it, revived it, got it to grow and reproduce, so they have a lot of it, and they use it to brew their beer. They never stopped to think, how in the world could it last that long? The experiments show the amber won't last, no biochemicals will last. How can it actually be able to reproduce even? Unless it's very young, just a few thousands of years old, dating back to the time of the flood. It seems inconceivable. Now, in Scientific American magazine, back in 1993, they made a lot more admissions back then because we hadn't really found the good dinosaur soft tissue. Now that we've done that, they don't want anybody knowing about it, they don't talk about this. But back then, this article said, certain physical limits seem inescapable. In approximately 50,000 years, water alone strips bases from the DNA. Oxygen also contributes to the destruction of DNA. Even in ideal conditions, in the absence of water and oxygen, and at low temperature, that old bugaboo nobody wants to talk about anymore, background radiation, must finally erase all genetic information. That's what they used to say. They don't own up to it anymore because we found things that they cannot explain. So they use censorship. They just don't talk about it, and if you don't know about it, you can't challenge them. Now here we have an interesting situation. Say you walked into a building and you saw sitting next to the microwave a hot steaming cup of coffee. And you saw next to it an ashtray with a cigarette that's still burning. What would you logically presume about how long it's been since somebody had been in that room? Minutes at the very most, seconds or minutes, because we all know from common experience, which is scientific observation by the way, that coffee does not remain hot for any longer than minutes, certainly not hours, and cigarettes don't burn any longer than minutes, certainly not hours. So you'd be justified in saying somebody must have heated up their coffee and was smoking a cigarette, maybe stepped out of the room seconds, if not just minutes before we entered. Anything illogical about that? Anything unscientific about that? But what if there's a strong motivation to deny logic and common sense? Say we have a building and there's a security company that says, we want to hire you to be our security guardians, and we're going to give you a multi-million-dollar contract, be our security agents, and if you prove your mettle by securing this building for over a year, and no trespassers can get into it, then we'll not only give you the big multi-million-dollar account, we'll also give you a multi-million-dollar bonus. Wow, that's some big incentive. So they put out their armed guards, they put up all kinds of cameras, and they guard that place for over a year. Then after a year, the time is up, they walk in, they're going to certify that indeed nobody has been in this building for over a year. But when they walk in, they find this hot cup of coffee by the microwave, and they find a burning cigarette. Now one of the honest members of the team says, oh my gosh, we didn't do our due diligence. We should have gotten ground penetrating radar and searched for underground tunnels. Obviously, it must be an underground tunnel. Somebody came up and probably behind one of these big bookcases, a secret passage. They came in and they were smoking a cigarette, drinking some coffee. They heard us rattle in the door and they escaped out the secret passage. Now that's eminently more reasonable than saying, well, it's just stayed like that for over a year. But that's literally the position the evolutionists have put themselves in. All this dinosaur soft tissue and everything, we all agree we're the experts. Don't listen to these gadfly creationists. They don't know what they're talking about. Just ignore common sense, ignore the experiments, ignore truth that is obvious because they have agenda. People don't ignore common sense and logic and obvious truth unless they have a big motivation to do it. In this case, it's the money. Money talks. Money causes people to do all kinds of terrible things, worse than just lying. But the evolutionists basically have said what these guys were saying. Look, if we all just agree, we're the security experts, we all agree that nobody's been in this room, the media listens to us, they bow down before us, we're the experts, so they don't challenge us. If somebody finds out about this, we'll all just stand foursquare together and say, well, yes, normally it doesn't last that long, but we, the experts, agree that under unusual circumstances, it can last for more than a year, and you can't say anything against us because we're the experts. Well, yes, you can. Common sense and logic trumps expert testimony because all experts are human. They have the human frailties of pride, prejudice, preconceived ideas, and an agenda that they want to defend no matter what. So just because the authorities say so doesn't make sense. If they're asking you to divorce yourself from common sense and logic and common experience to believe what they tell you, you better believe there's a big agenda behind it. And that's exactly what the evolutionists have been doing today. Now, I close with this quote from the first century Roman poet, Marcus Martial. He said, "A drop of amber from the weeping plant fell unexpected and embalmed an ant. The little insect we so much condemn is from a worthless ant become a gem." And you know, that's true. If you find an insect in a piece of amber, in Baltic amber, that's only about 1 in 1,000 pieces have an insect inclusion of any kind. They're a little more prominent in Myanmar, former Burma, where it's more like 1 in 500. But it is more valuable if you have plant or animal fossils in it. So why is it so valuable to us? We'll conclude with this look at the amber room again, because amber is especially valuable and beautiful to the creationists because it has declared that God's history of this world is true, that fossil record had to have been laid down rapidly and recently, no more than about 4,500 years. The exquisite preservation that we see, even of the tiniest, finest hairs on mites, is inconceivable of any kind of long-scale frame. Knowing what we know about thermodynamics and ground radiation is just inconceivable, just like it's inconceivable a hot cup of coffee and a lit cigarette can just keep going for over a year. It's ludicrous, and we need to call a spade a spade. The emperor is naked, and we need to all stand up and say, you're naked. We're not buying this lie that you have special magical clothes and you're naked as a jaybird. So, okay. Now, the amber room, in all of its glory and majesty, pales in comparison to what God has promised us. By faith in Jesus Christ, we will inherit a new heaven and new earth where righteousness dwells, no more sorrow, no more sickness, no more pain, no more tears, no more curse, and no more death, for the former things have passed away. The heavenly city, the New Jerusalem, comes down out of heaven to the renewed earth. And it says, behold, the tabernacle of God is with men, and he will dwell with them and be their God, and we shall dwell with him and be his people, and we will have greater glory and grandeur and beauty that makes the amber room pale in comparison. The city with streets and buildings of gold, 12 different beautiful gemstones in its foundation, and awesome, optimum, eternal abode. Why can we believe the promise of God in Revelation about the eternal city we will inhabit? Because God has proven with amber, with this jewel, he has proven that his word is true in Genesis. And if we can believe his word in Genesis, we certainly should believe it in Revelation. We truly do have a glorious future waiting for us. If we don't believe lies like evolution, we hold fast to the truth that was once for all delivered to the saints in the gospel of Jesus Christ.